Folke Bernadotte was born on January 2, 1895 in Stockholm, Sweden. As the grandson of King Oscar II, he came from prestigious Swedish nobility and grew up in privilege. He was one of 4 sons born to Count Oscar Bernadotte and his wife Ebba Munk of Fulkila, his father Count Oscar Bernadotte of Wisborg, formerly known as Prince Oscar of Sweden and Duke of Gotland, prior to renouncing those titles. Count Oscar was the second son of King Oscar II of Sweden. In 1888, Prince Oscar had married Ebba Henrietta Munk av Fulkila without consent from the king, which subsequently forced him to relinquish his royal titles and position. As compensation, Oscar's uncle, Adolf I, Grand Duke of Luxembourg, granted him the hereditary title of Count of Wisborg in 1892. Folke's mother, Ebba, came from aristocracy as well, having been a lady-in-waiting to Crown Prince Gustav's wife, Victoria of Baden. Despite his exiled status from the Swedish royal house, Folke Bernadotte's illustrious lineage linked him to Scandinavian nobility on both sides. This privileged bloodline would shape his future engagement with high society diplomatic pursuits. Bernadotte spent his childhood between his family's manor house in Sweden and palace in Copenhagen. He received a well-rounded education befitting nobility, first being privately tutored at home before attending the Royal Military Academy from age 14. There he received military training focused on horsemanship and cavalry tactics. Bernadotte went on to study law at the University of Uppsala. However, with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, he decided to forgo a law career and focus on military service. Coming from such a privileged upbringing and noble family would shape Bernadotte's sense of obligation to public service later in his diplomatic career. Folke Bernadotte met the love of his life in 1927 while vacationing at a Swedish summer resort. The woman who caught his eye was Estelle Romaine Manville, a charming American socialite from a wealthy New York family. By all accounts, it was love at first sight for the Swedish nobleman and the sophisticated young American woman. After a brief courtship, Folke proposed to Estelle while sailing his yacht off the coast of Sweden. She happily accepted. The wedding between Folke Bernadotte and Estelle Manville took place on December 1, 1928, in her hometown of Pleasantville, New York. Their marriage brought together Swedish nobility and American upper-class families in what was seen as a prestigious high society match. The ceremony, held at Estelle's family estate, was attended by over 200 distinguished guests, including European royals and prominent American business leaders. As a member of Swedish nobility and grandson of King Oscar II, Folke's wedding was covered extensively in the press in Europe and America. After honeymooning through Europe, Folke and Estelle settled into married life together. The early years were spent primarily in Sweden, where Folke continued his professional military career. Estelle adapted to her new life abroad with grace and charm. The couple divided their time between Stockholm and her family's estate. Wherever Folke's diplomatic travels took them, Estelle provided unwavering support. In 1930, Folke and Estelle welcomed their first child, son Gustav. He was followed by 3 more boys in the coming years: Folke Jr. in 1931, Frederick in 1934, and finally Bertil in 1935. Folke was said to be a devoted family man who, despite his busy career, always made time for his wife and sons. The family frequently sailed around Scandinavia on Folke's yacht, creating cherished memories for the boys. They would reminisce about the adventures and quality time spent with their father. With 4 rambunctious young sons at home, Estelle had her hands full. She managed the household staff and personally saw to the children's care and education. The family divided their time between Sweden and the United States. For a period, they lived in New York so the boys could attend American schools. Estelle also traveled with Folke on diplomatic trips when possible, supporting his career. After marrying Estelle Romaine Manville in 1928, Folke Bernadotte embarked on a series of distinguished diplomatic appointments that demonstrated Sweden's trust in his capabilities. In 1933, he had the honor of serving as Sweden's delegate to the Chicago Century of Progress Exposition, which allowed him to promote Swedish industry and technology to the world. His talent for representation was again called upon for the New York World's Fair from 1939 to 1940, where he served as Sweden's Commissioner General. As tensions escalated in Europe, Bernadotte dedicated himself to civilian defense efforts. Combining his passions for youth initiatives and emergency response, he coordinated the training of Swedish scouts in anti-aircraft maneuvers and first aid to support the nation's safety. During World War II, his leadership abilities were formally recognized when he was named vice chairman of the Swedish Red Cross in 1943. Through these varied positions, Bernadotte gained valuable experience in diplomacy, organization, and crisis response that would prove indispensable later in his mediation work. Folke Bernadotte's humanitarian efforts during World War II demonstrated his adeptness as a diplomat and crisis mediator. As vice chairman of the Swedish Red Cross in 1945, he sought to negotiate an armistice agreement between Germany and the Allied forces. In the war's final days, Bernadotte received an extraordinary offer from Heinrich Himmler to facilitate Germany's complete surrender to Britain and the United States on the condition that Germany could maintain resistance against the Soviet Union. Bernadotte responsibly communicated the proposal to Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Harry S. Truman, though the leaders ultimately declined it. Concurrently, Bernadotte spearheaded a critical rescue operation to transport interned Norwegians, Danes, and other Western European inmates from German concentration camps to the safety of hospitals in Sweden. Through this effort, known as the White Buses Expedition, Bernadotte's team evacuated between 6,500 and 11,000 Jews, among approximately 15,000 people liberated in total. In April 1945, Himmler again approached Bernadotte to propose conveyance of a German peace offer to General Eisenhower that would isolate the Soviet Union from surrender negotiations. While informing Himmler of the offer's unlikely success, Bernadotte dutifully passed the message to the Swedish government for review. Despite no tangible outcome, these actions exemplified Bernadotte's emergence as a pragmatic intermediary between ideological opponents in the most dire of circumstances. Throughout World War II, Folke Bernadotte leveraged his leadership role in the Swedish Red Cross to orchestrate critical humanitarian operations. In 1943 and 1944, he facilitated prisoner of war exchanges that enabled 11,000 individuals to return home through Sweden. When Bernadotte traveled to Germany in spring 1945, seeking to retrieve Norwegian and Danish prisoners per his initial directive, he met unexpectedly with Heinrich Himmler, who had recently assumed command of the entire German army. After Germany's surrender on May 1st, Swedish newspaper Svenska Dagbladet reported that Bernadotte had emancipated approximately 15,000 prisoners from German concentration camps. This figure included 8,000 Norwegians and Danes, along with 7,000 women of French, Polish, Czech, British, American, Argentinian, and Chinese nationality. The 2-month rescue missions placed Red Cross personnel in substantial danger due to political volatility and proximity to Allied bombing targets. The expeditions were dubbed the White Buses due to the buses' stark white paint that identified them as non-military vehicles. In total, Bernadotte amassed 308 volunteers along with 36 buses, 19 trucks, 7 cars, 7 motorcycles, 1 tow truck, 1 field kitchen, and full provisions to execute the trips without German assistance. Even after the ceasefire, the White Buses venture persevered through June 1945 and rescued 10,000 more individuals. Bernadotte chronicled the White Buses story in his 1945 Swedish book, The End, My Humanitarian Negotiations in Germany in 1945 and Their Political Consequences, describing his dialogues with Himmler and experiences at Ravensbrück camp. His first-hand account provided a compelling record of both the ongoing human suffering and the immense possibility for good, even in the war's darkest days. In the aftermath of the White Buses expedition, select controversies emerged surrounding Folke Bernadotte's leadership, stemming from both personal feuds and debates about mission priorities. Bernadotte had a contentious relationship with Felix Kirsten, Himmler's masseur, who facilitated Bernadotte's access but whom Bernadotte declined to credit post-war. This tension entered the public discourse when British historian Hugh Trevor Roper published a 1953 article based on Kirsten's interview and documents that minimized Bernadotte's role and claimed he opposed rescuing Jews. However, Trevor Roper soon retreated from these allegations after revelations that Kirsten had fabricated documents to exaggerate his efforts against a fictitious Nazi deportation plot. In a 1995 admission to journalist Barbara Amiel, Trevor Roper expressed uncertainty regarding his original charges. Multiple historians have since questioned Kirsten's account, judging the accusations as distortions or forgeries. Certain doubts also emerged in Scandinavia about the prominence given to Scandinavian prisoners during the White Buses mission. However, political scientist Sune Persson determined such skepticism was contradicted by evidence. Persson conclusively stated, "The accusations against Count Bernadotte, to the effect that he refused to save Jews from the concentration camps, are obvious lies." He cited numerous eyewitness accounts absolving Bernadotte, including the World Jewish Congress's Stockholm representative in 1945. While assessing leaders' wartime decisions often proves difficult in hindsight, the weight of facts suggests Folke Bernadotte conducted the White Buses initiative with humanitarian objectives despite operating within severe constraints. By contextualizing controversy, historians may better comprehend the complexity of moral choices during conflict. Folke Bernadotte's renowned diplomacy and mediation credentials led to his landmark appointment by the United Nations as the first official mediator of the conflict in Palestine on May 20, 1948. His selection followed the 1947 UN Partition Plan, which proposed establishing a Jewish majority state and an Arab majority state with Jerusalem under international control. However, surrounding Arab nations rejected the plan and attacked Israel immediately after its declaration of statehood on May 14th. As mediator, Bernadotte faced the immense challenge of securing an acceptable compromise between deeply opposed sides. He advocated a federation model of dual states rather than strict partition. Bernadotte also strived to project neutrality, cognizant that the Red Cross was perceived as pro-Jewish by some Arabs. While representing Red Cross ideals of humanity, he took care to clarify that he was not in the Middle East in any official Red Cross capacity. His judicious diplomacy sought to build confidence in his impartiality. Despite time constraints and escalating violence, Bernadotte initiated intensive negotiations with involved parties. He worked tirelessly to achieve incremental agreements that could form the foundation for a lasting settlement. Though the situation ultimately proved intractable during his tenure, Folke Bernadotte's appointment affirmed global trust in Swedish diplomacy and his personal skills as a rational interlocutor between sworn enemies. Folke Bernadotte's first formal proposal as mediator, submitted discreetly to involved parties on June 28, 1948, recommended merging Palestine and Transjordan into a unified federal state with distinct Jewish and Arab entities. In crafting this vision, Bernadotte deftly balanced myriad complex factors. As he wrote that, in putting forward any proposal for the solution of the Palestine problem, one must bear in mind the aspirations of the Jews, the political difficulties and differences of opinion of the Arab leaders, the strategic interests of Great Britain, the financial commitment of the United States and the Soviet Union, the outcome of the war, and finally the authority and prestige of the United Nations. Regarding proposed boundaries, Bernadotte prudently advised further examination of multiple perspectives. His suggested boundaries encompassed portions of Palestine and Transjordan that accounted for Jewish and Arab populations while allowing access to Jerusalem. By thoughtfully delineating a starting point for dialogue, Bernadotte's plan highlighted that reconciliation, however difficult, could stem from mutual understanding. Although initial reactions were mixed, the proposal brought tangible ideas into focus for both parties to contemplate. Bernadotte's measured approach sought gradual confidence building through open communication, aiming to bridge divides between Israelis and Arabs. Following mixed reactions to his first proposition, Folke Bernadotte pivoted to a more nuanced proposal, abandoning the union model in favor of two fully independent states. He completed this revised plan on September 16, 1948, basing it upon these core tenets. Peace must return to Palestine, and every feasible measure should be taken to ensure that hostilities will not be resumed, and that harmonious relations between Arab and Jew will ultimately be restored. A Jewish state called Israel exists in Palestine, and there are no sound reasons for assuming that it will not continue to do so. The boundaries of this new state must finally be fixed, either by formal agreement between the parties concerned, or failing that, by the United Nations. Adherence to the principle of geographical homogeneity and integration, which should be the major objective of the boundary arrangements, should apply equally to Arab and Jewish territories, whose frontiers should not, therefore, be rigidly controlled by the territorial arrangements envisaged in the resolution of November 29th. The right of innocent people, uprooted from their homes by the present terror and ravages of war, to return to their homes should be affirmed and made effective, with assurance of adequate compensation for the property of those who may choose not to return. The city of Jerusalem, because of its religious and international significance and the complexity of interests involved, should be accorded special and separate treatment. International responsibility should be expressed where desirable and necessary in the form of international guarantees as a means of allaying existing fears, and particularly with regard to boundaries and human rights. With an aim toward reconciliation, Bernadotte's revised proposal put forth targeted recommendations includes: the existing indefinite truce should be superseded by a formal peace or at the minimum an armistice. The frontiers between the Arab and Jewish territories, in the absence of agreement between Arabs and Jews, should be established by the United Nations. The Negev should be defined as Arab territory. The frontier should run from Fallujah north-northeast to Ramleh and Lydda, both of which places would be in Arab territory. Galilee should be defined as Jewish territory. Haifa should be declared a free port, and Lydda Airport should be declared a free airport. The city of Jerusalem, which should be understood as covering the area defined in the resolution of the General Assembly of November the 29th, should be treated separately and should be placed under effective United Nations control, with maximum feasible local autonomy for its Arab and Jewish communities, with full safeguards for the protection of the holy places and sites and free access to them, and for religious freedom. The United Nations should establish a Palestine Conciliation Commission. The right of the Arab refugees to return to their homes in Jewish-controlled territory at the earliest possible date should be affirmed by the United Nations, and their repatriation, resettlement, and economic and social rehabilitation and payment of adequate compensation for the property of those choosing not to return should be supervised and assisted by the United Nations Conciliation Commission. Folke Bernadotte prepared his second proposal in confidential talks with British and American emissaries, though the exact influence of these discussions remains ambiguous. All documents were destroyed to maintain secrecy, but Bernadotte reportedly found substantial alignment between his views and those of the US and UK representatives. This confidentiality was compromised in October when details were publicly divulged just 9 days before the US presidential election. The unintended disclosure embarrassed President Truman, who reacted by asserting strong pro-Zionist stances. Truman's declaration contributed to defeating Bernadotte's plan at the UN over the next 2 months, as did the failure to establish a lasting ceasefire. Despite obstacles, Bernadotte secured 2 temporary truces from June 11 to July 8 and July 18 to October 15, 1948. Folke Bernadotte's mediation elicited criticism from the Israeli government regarding perceived impartiality issues. In July 1948, Bernadotte characterized Arab nations as unwilling to resume major combat in Palestine, framing ongoing clashes as isolated incidents. An Israeli spokesperson rebuked this portrayal, arguing that human casualties, truce violations, and defiance of the UN Security Council constituted far graver offenses than mere incidents. The statement continued that apologizing for Arab aggression hardly inspired confidence in Bernadotte resuming his facilitator role. This swift censure highlighted Israeli doubts about Bernadotte's neutrality. However, Bernadotte likely intended his phrasing to lower tensions rather than absolve responsibility. While perhaps undiplomatic, his language aligned with preventing further escalation. The heated exchange reflected the immense difficulty of retaining trust as an intermediary between volatile adversaries. Though Bernadotte strove to balance competing pressures, appeasing all sides proved impossible. The Israeli critique underscored how even subtle word choices could undermine fragile progress toward reconciliation. Folke Bernadotte's peacemaking ended tragically when he was assassinated by militants on September 17, 1948, in Jerusalem. Members of the Zionist paramilitary group Lehi ambushed Bernadotte's motorcade in the Katamon neighborhood. A Lehi operations leader in Jerusalem, Yehoshua Zettler, planned the attack, which was approved by a 3-man leadership cell, including future Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. 2 gunmen, Yitzhak Ben Moshe and Avraham Steinberg, shot out the tires of the UN vehicles. Yehoshua Cohen then opened Bernadotte's car door and fatally shot him at close range. Bullets also struck French UN observer Colonel André Serot in the seat beside Bernadotte, killing him as well. Meshulam Makover drove the getaway vehicle. General Åge Lundström, accompanying Bernadotte, recounted noticing a jeep obstructing the road and a man with a weapon emerge, assuming it was a checkpoint. Realizing shots were fired, Lundström saw Colonel Serot collapse and Bernadotte slump over, mortally wounded. At the hospital, Lundström conveyed the severity to doctors, but efforts to save Bernadotte proved unsuccessful. The assassination demonstrated extremists' readiness to eradicate moderation and dialogue in the conflict's inflammation. However, while violence ended Bernadotte's life, his vision for reconciliation lived on. His pioneering mediation efforts, though imperfect, pointed the way toward resolving seemingly intractable differences through persistence and humanity. The day after the assassination, the United Nations Security Council denounced the cowardly act as likely perpetrated by a criminal group of terrorists, while Folke Bernadotte pursued peace in Jerusalem. The militant Zionist group Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang, claimed responsibility under the name Hazit HaMoledet, the National Front, mimicking a Bulgarian resistance group's title. Lehi viewed Bernadotte as a British and Arab puppet who imperiled Israel's nascent statehood. They feared Israeli leaders would accept Bernadotte's latest peace proposals, which Lehi saw as detrimental despite an active truce. Ironically, Israeli officials had already privately rejected Bernadotte's plan in favor of military offensives before his murder. Lehi's violent fanaticism contrasted with Bernadotte's reasoned diplomacy. However, while terrorism silenced this mediator, his legacy of seeking common ground endured. As the Security Council's condemnation made clear, the values Bernadotte died for represented the future, while his killers embodied the extremism of a dark past. No bullets could kill the ideals of justice and understanding he so passionately championed. Despite condemnation, No prosecutions resulted from Folke Bernadotte's assassination. Leahy was forcibly disbanded and many arrested, but no charges were filed for the killings. Two Leahy members, Yelin Moore and Shmuelevich, were convicted only of terrorism membership before being immediately released and pardoned. Yelin Moore had already been elected to the Israeli Knesset. Years later, former Leahy member Yehoshua Cohen was revealed as one of the gunmen by David Ben-Gurion's biographer, while Cohen worked as Ben-Gurion's bodyguard. Not until 1977 did Leahy publicly acknowledge its role. By then, the statute of limitations for murder had long expired. Initially suspecting Israeli agents, the Swedish government decried the inadequate investigation and unsuccessfully tried delaying Israel's admission to the UN. Sweden eventually recognized Israel in 1950, but frosty relations persisted despite reconciliation attempts like Israel's Bernadotte Forest. At a 1995 Tel Aviv ceremony with Sweden's Deputy Prime Minister, Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres finally offered indirect acknowledgement through condemning terror, voicing regret about the murder and thanking Bernadotte for Jewish rescue efforts. Peres expressed hope the ceremony would help in healing the wound